The next item on our agenda, members, is House File 4819. Chair Howard, would you like to move your bill?
Yes, I'll move the bill.
Chair Howard moves that House File 4819 be referred to the Commerce, Finance, and Policy Committee. Chair Howard, I understand that you have an A2 amendment. Would you like to describe that amendment? And describe the amendment, please.
I would move the A2 amendment, which makes a series of changes that we think gets the bill in better shape. It adds clarity and reflects feedback from the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency to get the bill in the shape to meet our intent.
Thank you, Chair Howard. Any discussion to the A2 amendment? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. Chair Howard, to your bill as amended.
Members, House File 4819 is a bill that reflects that we need to be in an all-hands-on-deck mode to address our affordable housing crisis. There's a role for private investment, for public investment, and as we just discussed in the last bill, our nonprofit affordable housing providers who together have tens of thousands of units of housing across the state who, if not for their leadership and for their work to provide this housing, we would have a problem of an inordinate magnitude. They've stepped up to do some of the housing that is the most hard to finance on razor-thin margins, the communities and populations that can be challenging to serve and matching services with those folks, and in buildings that are aging, like other state assets are aging. And it's important to note that a lot of these nonprofit housing providers really are facing a perfect storm over the last several years. I mentioned that the age of a lot of their properties, the economic challenges coming out of the pandemic and in terms of collecting rents for their populations, exploding insurance costs, structural challenge with things like the coordinated entry system. The list goes on, and what it's added up to is nonprofit housing providers that are in significant financial distress. And these are, again, I view as state assets. They were projects that were likely developed with public financing, and we have a public interest in making sure that we continue to provide these units. And if we don't, we've already heard examples of units that will be lost forever. And preservation is the right priority, and it's also one that saves costs in a sense. If we preserve the affordable housing that we have, that's going to be cheaper than creating new, and of course we need to do both. But the reality is that units are at risk across our state, and this is a bill that includes a menu of items that are designed to create a pathway to financial stability and housing stability ultimately for tens of thousands of Minnesotans, which should be our vested vital interest. The bill does that in a few ways. It includes a definition of recapitalization and accessibility for housing infrastructure bonds, which we just discussed in the previous bill. It includes some other tools and mechanisms to create financing flexibility for these providers. And it looks at, as we're directing resources, how do we prioritize this preservation and make sure we're actually deploying real dollars through the HIB process to these entities. The bill also includes some task force language because this is, to Lee Johnson's point, there's some structural issues at play that warrant everybody that's involved in this space to study and work to achieve long-term stability. And specifically, it also includes a task force on insurance costs, which is a national issue that's facing property owners all across the country, really. But it is very pronounced for our nonprofit affordable housing providers that don't have the margins or the rent collections to sort of weather what like some of our for-profits have. But this is an issue, the insurance one is one that's not easily solved and one that requires a greater study. And so that task force is included in this language as well. As I mentioned, in total, what this package says that we, as the state of Minnesota, have a vested interest in the success of our nonprofit affordable housing providers, and that with their success is our success as a state. And this bill represents that and puts us on a path towards stability so that we make sure we're preserving the affordable housing that we do have all across the state.
All right. Thank you for that introduction, Chair Howard. We've got 4 testifiers on the list. The first is Ellen Solly. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chair Howard, and members. My name is Ellen Solly. I'm president of the Family Housing Fund. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Andrea Brennan, who will follow me, who is the president of the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund. And together, we help communities throughout Minnesota address their affordable housing needs. Complementing your investments, the 2 funds have invested more than $1.2 billion in private capital in the continuum of housing throughout Minnesota, from shelter to rental housing to home ownership. And our goal is to partner with government and developers to build a housing system that works for everyone. As such, we're in a good position to talk about the proposed legislation, House File 4819. I'll speak to the challenges that rental property owners are facing, and Andrea will talk specifically about how the proposed legislation addresses those challenges. As Chair Howard alluded to, many affordable rental housing operators are facing challenges that surfaced during the pandemic, yet the roots of the problems that they're experiencing predate the pandemic. There are varying causes, yet the challenges impact the affordable housing sector and the residents who call these developments home. Further, these affordable housing developments represent critical infrastructure investment that the state of Minnesota has made. The 2 housing funds' goal is to continue our partnership with you to preserve these valuable affordable housing infrastructure investments. Here's the challenge. Affordable rental housing providers have experienced significantly higher operating expenses from increased property insurance, additional costs of insurance or of security, higher property maintenance costs, and overall staffing, while experiencing a decrease in revenue from rent arrears, inefficient or slow rental payments. Chair Howard spoke to many of these challenges already. As a result, many nonprofit affordable housing providers have had to delay much-needed maintenance to stay afloat against the backdrop of dramatic increases in operating costs and revenue reductions. This is not by choice. It's by necessity. And if we fail to address the challenge today, we put the people who currently reside in these properties at risk. A potential consequence is alarming. Our coalition has identified a minimum of 3,500 rental units across the state that have been sold in the past year, are being actively marketed, or are being considered for sale. That's a pretty significant number and makes a significant impact if those properties are sold on the overall stock of affordable housing in our state. It's also important to note that this situation is not unique to Minnesota. Across the country, states and cities are grappling with the same issue. And there's no easy fix, but with your support, we can make progress. And I thank you for your attention and opportunity to appear in front of you.
Thank you, Ellen Solly. Next up is Andrea Brennan. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Chair Norris and members of the committee. I'm Andrea Brennan, president of the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund. Last legislative session, you approved historic levels of new resources for affordable housing creation and preservation. The successful implementation of these historic resources will, in large part, depend on the health of our housing providers, those working on the front lines to provide safe and decent and affordable homes for our most vulnerable residents in Minnesota. One of the unique assets that Minnesota has is a very robust network of nonprofit housing providers whose mission it is to not just provide bricks and mortar housing for people who need affordable housing, but to provide homes with services and access to all of the things that people need in order to be successful in their lives. You also recognized the importance of these housing providers in the system and took action to provide some financial relief for some of the challenges that you've heard today. Some of this relief came in the form of Stable Housing Organization Relief Program, or SHORP. Thank you for this investment. It is providing a lifeline for many organizations, and it created a bridge to help us develop a longer-term plan to stabilize and recapitalize existing affordable housing throughout the state. Since October, the two funds, Family Housing Fund and Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, together with LISC Twin Cities and the Metropolitan Consortium of Community Developers, have been convening a coalition of 36 affordable housing providers, organizations, and philanthropy that focus on affordable housing statewide. More than 70 people from these organizations have engaged in this robust discussion that has occurred over 20 meetings in the last several months. The coalition has developed and refined some of the components in the bill before you today, including the expansion of housing infrastructure bonds to be able to be used for recapitalization of existing affordable housing, adding the recapitalization of distressed affordable housing that was created through the investment of past investments, public investment, beyond just HIBs, but allowing other state resources to be used for the purpose of preserving our existing affordable housing stock through recapitalization is another component. And then also to look at administrative changes and how we can allocate these resources in ways that ensure the long-term success of properties that are financed with state funding. Additionally, and beyond this legislation, because legislation is part of the solution, not all of the solution, we are working with Minnesota Housing and local government funders to increase collaboration around ways that we can work together and collaboratively to stabilize existing distressed affordable housing. Taken together, these changes will help preserve both current and future affordable housing that low-income Minnesotans depend on. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea Brennan. Next up is Deidre Schmidt. Once you get seated, please introduce yourself for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Chair Norris, members of the committee, pardon me. Thank you for hearing me today in support of House File 4819. Common Bond Communities, I'm Deidre Schmidt, and I'm the president and CEO at Common Bond Communities. Common Bond provides housing and supportive services in 50 Minnesota cities. We provide homes for more than 1,600 renter households in the districts represented by lawmakers on this committee. We provide housing for extraordinarily low-income seniors, those coming out of homelessness, as well as working families. And all of Common Bond residents can take advantage of our free services to help them stabilize and thrive. I am grateful that the legislature acted last year to support housing production and resident stability in a really historic way. I'd like to urge you to keep pushing for the types and amounts of housing resources that we need in Minnesota to not only produce new, but also maintain existing affordable housing. One key theme in the conversations that the Greater Minnesota and Family Housing Fund, and the number one priority in my mind, the theme of those conversations and the number one priority in my mind is making sure that the affordable housing that we already own is well-maintained and prudently staffed. Given inflation in the operating expense categories that are largely beyond our discretion and our control, like insurance and utilities and security, which were mentioned earlier, Many of our properties are running operating deficits. Operating deficits result when revenues from rents that are affordable to low-income folks do not generate enough to cover the expenses of those same homes. That is the case in most of our properties currently. Common Bond has cash advances outstanding to 2/3 of our housing communities, which is 7,200 homes. This totals nearly $20 million. And I would suggest that this shows how seriously we take our responsibility, Representative Johnson, when we sign on to develop and operate these properties. Many people are surprised to hear that we don't receive operating funds to support our work over time. The low-income housing tax credit and subordinate loans that are funded through the state agency and local governments and that comprise most of the resources that we have to do our work are one-time infusions to build homes. They're not intended to, and nor do they, consistently maintain them or provide social services. Now, we are working hard to find any efficiencies that we can, and we have been tightening our belt in all aspects of our operations. In fact, in November of last year, Common Bond had to reduce our workforce by 22 positions, bringing our staffing levels to a 10-year low. In the Minnesota Housing Partnership Survey that was referenced earlier, many of our peers reported being in a similar position and having really very limited choices of action in front of them. Many had deferred maintenance in order to pay their mortgages or to keep lights on or provide critical staffing. Maintenance and staffing levels are two areas of cost that we know most immediately and directly impact resident experience and neighbor experience. Cuts in these areas also undermine the quality of the physical assets in the long term. What many Common Bond properties and those of our peers require is financial restructuring and additional investment in older properties, like the one that Claire Housing was discussing. And in order to do that, as well as to continue to produce new housing, our system needs additional resources, hence the request for an increase in the HIB. It also needs clear direction to prioritize this activity. Existing affordable housing assets, which have hundreds of millions of dollars of previous public investment, state, local, and federal, are indeed in danger. And the stability and sustainability of housing for so many Minnesotans might not include a ribbon cutting, but measures in House File 4819 will make sure that we aren't losing ground faster than we can build new homes. Thanks for hearing me today.
Thank you for your testimony, Deidre Schmidt. Last on the list is Chris Latondras. Once you get seated, please introduce yourself for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Norris, members of this committee. I'm Chris Latondras, President and CEO of Beacon Interfaith Housing Collaborative, and recently former Hennepin County Commissioner. I served as HRA Chair and Co-Chair of Heading Home Hennepin. Beacon is among Minnesota's most prolific developers of permanent supportive housing. That's deeply affordable homes with on-site services targeted to meet the unique needs of our residents. In the months since I traded my gavel for a hard hat, I've learned a few things that I wish I had better understood when I was a policymaker. Number one, Minnesota's nonprofit affordable housing ecosystem is extraordinary, but it's also fragile. Without this dynamic public-private partnership, few of our collective housing goals are possible, and we need to protect it. Two, the mental health crisis, opioid epidemic, and aftershocks of the pandemic economy have hit our residents hard. For Beacon, this means operational challenges, surging costs, and declining revenues stacked on top of already razor-thin margins and old assumptions about the actual costs of serving residents, especially in supportive housing. We're counting our runway to operate current service models in months rather than years. And I don't intend to be alarmist, but the stakes are high, with 3,500 units in our sector and thousands more residents at risk in the next year alone without urgent action. The state's SHORP funding came at a critical time. It's a lifeline, but it was also a short-term response to a structural problem. We need long-term systemic solutions, and that's what this legislation is about. It's about expanding housing investments to meet the moment, continuing to build new affordable housing with a newfound focus on adequately capitalizing services and operations reserves. It's about serving residents living in homes made possible by yesterday's state investments through recapitalization. And it's about reimagining our housing system moving forward. Minnesotans deserve a sustainable, affordable housing system that works, and this legislation puts Minnesota back on that path. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris Latondras. Any other members of the public who wish to testify? All right, seeing none, we'll move to member discussion, and I see Representative Petersburg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to briefly make sure that I understand the process, because we talk about this over the years as well. These housing infrastructure bonds, sometimes we talk about home ownership, other times we talk about multi-unit. Do these cover all aspects of housing, or are they strictly for a single home ownership?
Chair Howard.
Chair Norris, Representative Petersburg, there are in statute eligible uses for housing infrastructure bonds that over time has been expanded. So allowing for single family uses is in recent, I'm trying to remember the year, but it's fairly in recent history we've made that change. And so there's, it's in statute where HIBs can be applied. And this bill would clarify or make sure that this recapitalization is an eligible use.
Representative Petersburg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so I'm assuming that these properties, these units, housing units, have some sort of revenue recapture as well. Where does that revenue go to?
Chair Howard.
Chair Norris, Representative Petersburg, to support the, I mean, I think what we heard from our folks is that while their revenues have dropped, it sort of supports the viability of the nonprofit itself. But because we've sort of seen their revenues dwindle, or dwindle is maybe not the right word, but shrink while costs are growing, that's partly why they're facing this challenge.
Representative, you're good?
Thank you. No, I've got a few more questions. if I could.
Representative Petersburg.
Thank you. So it sounds like what you're saying is that right now the revenue recapture is going back towards actually just running the properties and maintaining it, which still isn't keeping up. But the bonds were actually created to actually create the asset itself.
Yes.
And so, and we know that that's only going to get worse going into the future, meaning, again, more and more subsidy on top of the other piece. My final question is just, so then who ends up owning the asset, the equity in this facility?
Chair Howard.
Chair Norris, Representative Petersburg, the nonprofit housing providers, themselves are the operators. And I would, if there's a more specific answer from some of our providers, I'd invite folks up, but.
Well, let me ask.
Representative Petersburg.
Well, I mean, I think that's the question I have. So the bond pays for the building or the purchase or the recapitalization, whatever, and it's just basically given to the operator to run without any input from them. And they are having now trouble making ends meet with just providing the maintenance and capital in order to keep the property up and running. That means that these bonds then aren't ever going to be generated back, which means that they are indeed going to be a full requirement of debt service for us into the future, which, again, I just want to make sure I'm clear that the asset then and the equity in that asset then goes with the provider that's getting it without any consideration back to the state. Is that correct?
Representative Petersburg, Chair Howard, I don't know, it looks like Deidre Schmidt might be available to answer the question if.
I'll take a stab and
Okay.
then why don't you come up. But what I would say is what the state is getting is an asset that we've put investment into. making sure that we continue to be providing affordable housing for Minnesotans. And if not for this public investment, that housing could absolutely go away. So I would say Minnesota is absolutely, if the getting something, what they're getting is, protecting this state asset, this state investment.
Deidre Schmidt?
And I can maybe add a little bit more technical detail. So first to say one of the virtues of the housing infrastructure bond is its flexibility. As you noted, it can be used for a number of different purposes. It can also be used in conjunction with a number of other financing mechanisms, the low-income housing tax credit, senior programs through HUD. And so there are a variety of ownership models that go along with those kind of additional funding sources. But one thing that you should know about the housing infrastructure bond is that while it kind of divorces the repayment source from the financing mechanism, the State Housing Finance Agency has the ability to and does put a lien on the properties where it gives the housing infrastructure bonds. And so it doesn't give up on the prospect of eventual repayment at some point in history, particularly if the asset were to go out of use in service to the populations that it was intended to serve.
Representative Petersburg.
Just one last question, because that kind of confuses me a little bit. So you say they have a lien on the property. Does that mean that if the property should be sold or whatever by the owner, the state would get some of that back, or does that stay with the person who, or group that owns it right now?
Deidre Schmidt.
I'm sure there's variation within the portfolio, but I'll tell you, when we have deals that we have that are financed through housing infrastructure bonds, there is a lien that is placed on the property to the benefit of the state. It may not be that there's, ultimately, especially if the properties are allowed to deteriorate, there may not be sufficient value in the deteriorated assets over time so that you could find yourself with a piece of paper that's a lien that doesn't provide you any value. But the point that I was trying to make is that the state not only gets the benefit that Representative Howard was talking about over time of the continued provision of quality, affordable housing for those who really cannot afford much in the way of rents, but it also does have a long-term string, if you will, tied to the actual asset.
Representative Petersburg.
Thank you. We'll talk more about this as it goes forward, but it does seem that if the state has allowed it to deteriorate to that level, we've not done our due diligence. And I don't disagree. The state is getting the benefit of the housing. So that's part of what's valuable. The question I always had is where does the asset, where does the actual, because generally speaking, all assets like this grow in value. And so that value is also there as well. And so I always look for, follow the money, shall we say. So, but I understand it does have a value for people to provide housing. I'm not disagreeing there. I'm just trying to figure out the dynamics and the composition of it. Thank you.
All right. Representative Dotseth.
Thank you, Representative Chair Howard. The question I would have is, I'm assuming we probably have a record of how many units this encompasses. Do we have a record of that?
Chair Howard.
Chair Norris, Representative Dotseth, there isn't like an obvious, clear way to know the exact amount of units, but I think it's fair to say and we've heard sort of testimony that several thousand units are probably at risk. And in collection, a lot of I think we're talking about tens of thousands of units in terms of affordable housing providers that operate this kind of housing that are experiencing these kinds of challenges.
Representative Dotseth.
Thank you, Representative Chair Howard. With that, do we have any accounting of how many vacancies we have in those current units right now?
Chair Howard.
Chair Norris, Representative Dotseth, I don't have a clear number. I know that vacancies is part of a structural challenge. This kind of gets in the weeds a little bit, but I mentioned challenges with coordinated entry. There's some systemic challenges with that. It's one of the things that I think we have this task force in here to sort of study what are the issues to get to long-term sort of stability. I think this is the vacancy issue is one of them because from my vantage point, the issue isn't that there aren't people that could fill these units. The issues are structural challenges to make sure that we can connect people with the housing that's available. And so this bill would seek to work through some of those structural challenges and provide us with some guidance about how to reform state policies, et cetera, to get us to a better place.
Representative Dotseth.
Just a follow-up question. If you were to guess, what percentage would you say would be vacancies right now?
Chair Howard.
I don't have that information. I don't think it's a huge number, but it's a number that carries with it, given the kind of the margins we're talking, a considerable cost for a developer to have a unit open.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion to the bill? All right. Representative Hussein.
I don't have any question. Chair Howard, thank you for working so hard and try to address the issue that we're seeing, the housing crisis in our state. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Any further or final remarks, Chair Howard?
Chair Norris, members, I appreciate the discussion. This is an issue that we really need to be laser focused on as the legislature and as the state of Minnesota to seek solutions for our whole housing ecosystem. We can't ignore these challenges, and we have a role to play. That's what this bill recognizes, and look forward to the work we still have to do this session in moving this and like-minded policy forward. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, Chair Howard renews the motion that House File 4819, as amended, be referred to the Commerce, Finance, and Policy Committee. All in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no? No. The motion prevails, and House File 4819, as amended, is referred to the Commerce, Finance, and Policy Committee.